Hey, everybody. I've been getting a lot of questions from my students and from various people, and I've been listening to various dialogues about what's currently happening in terms of the protests against police brutality. Again, a lot of questions about, what are the motivations, who is in charge? Do we have any leadership? What are our ultimate goals? And even with today, with Blackout Tuesday, what's the purpose? Are we cutting off our channels and our avenues of communication by quote unquote blacking ourselves out? And what are the implications of doing so on a Tuesday like today? And the effects of the various places that are having primaries, so lots and lots of questions that have been posed to me, text messages, Facebook posts, etc., of people seeking information, clarity, and answers. And so while I can't speak to the motivations of the different groups that are involved within the protest, and of course I can't speak to the motivations of the individuals involved in the protest, I hope that I can provide a little bit of clarity in some of the areas surrounding just protest in general, and some of the things that we may or may not know about protests, Black people in protest, etc. So I've heard the phrase, "we are not our ancestors." And it's being said in a very defiant way, and I respect the defiance. And it's being said to, I'm guessing, the greater American society, and saying that, our ancestors may have reacted one way, but we aren't going to react that way. Maybe that reaction was nonviolent, maybe that reaction was docile. I don't know exactly what that reaction is, but it's being said in a way to say, your actions are not going to be met in the ways that maybe they were met in the past. The problem with this statement is that it's ahistorical. And it's somewhat disrespectful, but it's ahistorical and disrespectful because it doesn't show all of the effort, the organization, the lives that were put on the line, the people who were injured, people who were maimed, the people who died as a result of these quote unquote nonviolent protests, right? It makes it seem as though the gains that were made, and it makes it seem as though the organizations that were formed had no impact, and that we aren't necessarily walking specifically in the gains of individuals who were directly involved in the civil rights movement and the Black Arts, Black Power movement. And so I think that we ought to be careful when we make certain statements, because although we may have the intention to say one thing, you might actually be saying more than you really know that you are. And so when I say that it's ahistorical or ahistoric, I mean that for those who are students of Black history, and more specifically Black movements, political movements, socio-political movements, we know that there are elements of the civil rights movements and the Black Power, Black Arts, Black Power movement that we're not necessarily seeing right now that we could benefit from. And a part of what some of the things that we're not necessarily seeing, and for a number of reasons, we're not seeing any solid central leadership. Now, it's understandable why we may not want leadership, because we know that leadership becomes somewhat of a figurehead, it becomes the face, it becomes centered around that leadership, and that can be problematic, and it was problematic in some sense for both civil rights movement and the Black Arts, Black Power movement. But a part of having leadership is direction, that the movement itself can move towards a specific goal or goals under the direction of not just one person, but under the direction of some sort of centralized leadership. We don't necessarily have that. And the fact that we don't have that, you can see that there's a lot of confusion about what the goals are, what the directions are. Is it going to be quote unquote peaceful or nonviolent? Or are we going to march? Are we going to sing? Or, if we are going to, and if people are going to be destructive, which is fine, if that's the way that they want to express themselves, what is the ultimate goal of that expression in the end, right? Because it is supposed to be to disrupt. There's just to be very clear that most of the outward showings of violence in terms of property is supposed to be destructive and disruptive for the purpose of making the American people uncomfortable. It's supposed to be on the media. It's supposed to get out there. You're supposed to see the images because that's the purpose of it, right? Cool. But it's that thing is supposed to come in tandem with something else. And I'll get to that in just a second. But without sort of direction and understanding the ultimate goals and the end and what you're fighting for, it becomes problematic. Well, then you say, well, Joe, we're fighting for, we want to stop police brutality, down with the police, defund the police. Okay, cool. I have a problem with that. The thing is that your ask? So let me explain it this way. There are two sort of avenues when it comes to gaining sort of political, social change within a society. There's an informal avenue, there is a formal avenue. Most of us know the formal avenue, right? So the formal avenue would be voting, participating as a representative. It would be participating in the census. It would be possibly creating ballot questions or propositions. It would be going before your city council to speak at city council meetings. It could be volunteering with a nonprofit organization for registering people to vote, etc. All of those things are a part of our formal system of political participation, right? In order to garner some sort of change within a political system. Generally speaking, the goal there would be either to change a law or a policy, introduce a law or a policy, and or introduce a representative who's going to carry your issues to that particular political space, right? City council, state legislator, Congress, et cetera, whatever. In an effort to change a policy or to introduce a policy that becomes law that changes the lives of the people who are being affected. So that's the formal way. If for some reason you are not successful the formal way, and or if you want to couple this particular method, you may also include informal ways. But hold on. On this side too, you also have lawsuits. People like, Thurgood Marshall, right? Suing because laws were created at the state levels and the local levels that violated the constitutional rights of Black peoples, brown peoples, etc. at the federal level. So they were violating mostly my favorite amendment, the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection, Equal Citizenship Amendment. So those lawsuits were challenging the constitutionality, meaning are these laws constitutional, or are they infringing upon the constitutional rights of Black people, brown people throughout the US? Now over to the informal ways. Informal ways of garnering attention and forcing the establishment, meaning government officials, etc., the public, to pay attention to whatever the issues are, include marches, boycotting, revolts, rebellions, unrest, uprisings. Please notice that I did not use the word riot. We'll talk about that in a second. So what should be happening is that we have both the formal ways and the informal ways. Now I hear you as you say, but we done tried the formal ways. I completely understand. I do not disagree with you. But part of the issue with just relying on informal ways is that those informal ways must include some sort of ask in the formal space. Meaning, if you're just protesting because you're pissed off about police brutality, you burn down a building, cool, no problem. Now what? We want you to stop killing us. Okay, how? Don't kill us. Okay, what's going to be put in place to make sure that individuals cannot hide behind policies and laws and say, oh, this person has been killed, but this particular policy within the police policy protects them from being prosecuted, or protects them even when they are prosecuted? And or what are the policies around wrongful death suits that come as a result of police officers killing individuals? Police officers are not the ones that are fiscally responsible in most jurisdictions. Cities are paying these families in these wrongful death suits. So maybe one of the asks needs to be, police officers are fiscally responsible for any civil action or civil trial that comes up, that they are responsible for the death of an individual and not the city. So that's no longer the taxpayers that are paying for, and these individuals are paying for when they use unnecessary legal force against someone. What are the policies that are in place where they can say, I feared for my life? What does the language look like? Part of the demand that has to come from this informal space is that those types of policies are either removed, rewritten, and examined so that they don't create a space where individuals acting under the guise of being law enforcement can claim fear, and that's the reason why they engaged in lethal force. So the informal is necessary. The informal is important. The informal basically does not allow the public to continue to ignore a particular issue that Black people, brown people have been fighting about police brutality, injustice, etc., for decades. It brings it to their kitchen table. It brings it to their laptops. It brings it to their phones. It does not allow them to ignore it because it's disruptive. It's supposed to be inconvenient. It's supposed to be in your face. That is the purpose of an uprising. That's the purpose of a revolt. That's the purpose of a rebellion. That makes perfect sense. But even in that, you have to be able to have a list of your ask from the formal space. So while people may feel some kind of way, I don't know, about the NAACP, a part of the strategy that was so successful in terms of changing the laws, the Jim Crow laws in the South, etc., was the combination of the court cases that were going before the Supreme Court and the marches and the boycotts and, follow where I'm going with this, the sit-ins, right? So the NAACP has released some of its ask, meaning they're saying while people are out here protesting, while people are out here uprising, while they are engaging in civil unrest, we're going to sneak this in and say, these are the things that we need to see happening policy and law-wise in these various jurisdictions. Pause. The way that the U.S. government is set up, federalism, the separation between federal government and the state government, the things that deal with policing must happen at the state level. Policing is a state issue. It's underneath this umbrella called the general welfare, meaning that the states are concerned directly with the general welfare of its residents. The problem that we're enduring is that as residents of these states, we as residents are having our citizenship rights violated as residents. And the laws that are governing us as residents are the ones that are doing the violating via these particular individuals, these law enforcement individuals. So we must change these laws at the state level to make sure that they are not violating our rights. They're not violating our equal citizenship rights and our right to freaking live, right? Okay, cool. So they're asking that state legislators introduce a ban on the use of knee and chokeholds, illegal chokeholds, and pinning someone down with their knee. They're asking for the use of what they call a force continuum, meaning that basically that officers should be thinking about the level of force that they're using, and that on this continuum based on the situation, and that the force should align with the particular situation. Seems like common sense. I know. Seems like common sense to me as well. You would think traffic stop, death don't necessarily go with one another, but they're asking that this be written out so that it's understood and clear in all of these different jurisdictions and states. They're asking that the states open the records of some of the past incidences, especially dealing with issues of race, discrimination, etc., with law enforcement. And they're also asking that states and local jurisdictions introduce what they call citizenship review boards, basically bringing in citizens to review different cases and things that are happening and are associated with police officers. So, wrap that up. In order for movements to be successful, there are some elements, and I didn't go over all the elements. There are more elements, but one that is glaring in this particular situation, and I want to want people to keep this in mind, that we have to go both avenues. We've got to continue to do what we're doing in the formal setting by voting, by answering the census, by demanding from our elected officials, your city governments, city council, mayors, etc., county executives, from your state government, demanding that laws like what you call stand your ground laws, laws that protect police officers from being prosecuted in certain situations, certain cases, policies that allow police officers to continue to not be fiscally responsible for wrongful death suits. We have to push our elected officials to change those policies. It is the policies that enable the officers. Just because this particular officer was arrested, if the policies aren't changed, we will be back here soon. It will happen again and again. Clearly, we've had at least a decade of people being killed by law enforcement, and the outcome in those cases, more often than not, is that they're found not guilty. And part of the issue is the actual policies that are put in place, and those policies are the policies that juries are using when they're going back and doing their deliberations. It's not about whether it's right or wrong. It literally is about the letter of the law. So you have to change the policies, you have to change the laws in order to begin to change the behavior, because people have to suffer consequences for the behaviors that they engage in. And if the policies are there to protect their behaviors, you see no change. But in addition to that, we need the marches, we need the boycotts, we need the protests, we need the uprising, and sometimes you may need some level of quote unquote violence against property. Lives cannot be replaced, property can be. And if a people have been oppressed and repressed and suppressed for so long, and they've tried quote unquote other methods, and that it comes to the point where it bubbles up, then that's what it is. And if property happens to be destroyed in that process, it's unfortunate, but that's what insurance is for. We're concerned about the loss of life. We're not concerned about busted out windows. Windows can be replaced, life cannot be. So we need the combination of putting it in front of the American people and not allowing them to turn their face. And as a matter of fact, putting it in front of the world and not allowing the world to turn a blind eye, because the living conditions of Black people here in America happen to be at a higher quality than that of other places. Brutality is brutality. Oppression is oppression. And anywhere injustice is seen is not okay. So we have to be aware of that as well. I said very quickly that we don't use the term riot. Riot is problematic because you can Google it. It seems to me, but this is just me, that the way that they're trying to have a conversation about the word riot now is much different than the more traditional way that the word riot has been used. Riots are spontaneous. Riots generally have no purpose. Riots are generally not connected to any sort of societal condition or status of a particular group in society. It usually is not in response to sort of ill treatment or injustice. When you think riots, you should be thinking of, oh, my college won the, NCAA tournament. Let's go flip over cars. Let's go knock down poles. Let's go destroy some property because we're so excited, right? This is not that. Now, it's a whole other conversation to talk about individuals who may be engaging in looting, but that's another conversation, because we can talk about how we can look at capitalism. We can look at how some of these businesses in some of these areas, ain't gonna name no names, how people in that community may feel like they are being preyed upon by those businesses, and that capitalism sucks out their resources, sucks out their labor, and gives very little back to them. And so the idea that they're coming into these places and that they may be taking from and they're destroying these places, for a lot of people psychologically, they feel like the balance is sort of being tipped more to their side. But ultimately, in a capitalistic society, the consumer and the laborer doesn't necessarily come out better in the end anyway. But that's a whole other conversation. But as for those who may be engaging in different forms of disruption, this particular event, the death of George Floyd, is on what we like to call a continuum of events. This continuum of events includes varying deaths of individuals within the last 10 years, various instances of racism that have been broadcast, various instances of injustice that have been broadcast, treatment that has gone on in terms of redlining and housing and mass incarceration and the inequitable funding of schools and implicit bias that runs through our healthcare system. And I can continue on. Trust me, there's a lot. All of these things are continuously happening on this continuum: the defunding of social welfare programs, the microaggressions that people experience at work and in school and in places every day, and the imagery. Like, I can go on. This is happening on this continuum. And every time something happens on that continuum, it bubbles up within the community. It bubbles up within the souls and spirits of the people who are experiencing this thing, to the point where if you hear people, they're like, I just can't take it anymore. I just can't take it anymore, because it's constantly bubbling. You're dealing with generational cycles of poverty and abject poverty. You're dealing with images of negativity in Black people in the media. You're dealing with issues of misogyny within, even in the Black community or in the larger community. You're dealing with deaths from healthcare disparities in your own family. You're dealing with COVID. You're dealing with losing your job. You're dealing. All of these things are rising up, and I'm not saying it's not happening in other communities, but I'm saying that I'm speaking uniquely of the experience of being someone Black in America. And all of these things are rising up. And then on top of that, you see an image that tells you that your Black life can be taken out because somebody suspected that you possibly used a counterfeit 20. For the record, it was not counterfeit. You lost your life. All of this is happening in your life, and you lost your life because someone believed that you using a counterfeit $20 bill warranted the calling of the police, and the police thought that the overuse of lethal force warranted you possibly using a counterfeit $20 bill. Me seeing that, and people in the Black community seeing that, it is psychologically damaging. It's exhausting, and I'm preaching to the choir. But all of this thing, as I said, are happening on this continuum. And on this continuum, what those who study these particular things and what scholars are noticing and should be paying attention to is that people are becoming more cognitively liberated. Not woke. Woke is weak. But cognitive liberation comes when people have more access to information. People are becoming more aware of the systems and the structures that oppress them. People are becoming more aware of instances of oppression, repression, of murder, death that is happening systematically across the country, etc. And as people become more aware, and as the continuum continues to go, and as events are occurring and things are occurring, you get this unrest that happens within the people, and you get what we're dealing with right now. So this is not isolated. This is connected to the various historical events, the daily events, the daily microaggressions, the daily internalized, I don't want to say hatred, but the daily internalized hate that people are taught about themselves, about being who they are and how they show up in the world. All of these things are weighing on this particular group of people. They happen to be Black people in the United States. And couple that with everything else that's going on, COVID and quarantining and the loss of jobs and possibly the loss of life and income and all of those things all in once, you have a pressure cooker of emotions. So I say all this to say, people should continue to do and contribute to this cause in whatever way that they feel comfortable. Be very aware there is a role for everyone in the struggle. Not everyone is on the front line. There are some people who are on the sideline. There are people who are organizing. There are people who are donating. There are people who are writing to their mayor, writing to their city council. There are people who are writing to their congressperson and their senator. There are people who are, like I said, funding the movement. There are people who are a part of what we would call the network of communication, and those people are making sure that solid research vetted information is getting out to the people. There are people who are in charge of correcting the negative information that get out there. There are people like me who are the educators, the ones who impart the information so that those who take this information and now get that those two things need to meet for us to see lasting change, that they go back to wherever it is that whatever groups that they're a part of, and they say to the groups, what is our ask? What do we want from local and state officials in our jurisdiction to do about this issue? And if I'm not experiencing it to a certain extent, or I don't know how to get in contact with my local official, how can I support other people in their jurisdictions to get their elected officials to change policies associated with the use of lethal force, and to change policies associated with who is fiscally or financially responsible in these wrongful death suits, because taxpayers are paying for the decisions being made by law enforcement officials. And so, in short, no, you are not your ancestors, but prayerfully, you learn from the examples of your ancestors. You learn from the structures that were used in order to make their movements in their space successful. You learn that they had ask. You learn that they had direction. You learn that they had goals. You learn that they used the networks of communication that were already established for them. It happens to be in the Black church. For us, we have social media. Social media is not the movement. One more time. Social media is not the movement. Social media is the medium through which people become educated and enlightened and receive the information that they need to participate in the movement itself. But social media isn't the movement. Getting him fired isn't the movement. So we have to be very aware of understanding the tools that are available to us and how to use those tools. But we also need to be aware that history has given us a roadmap of how to deal with this particular government structure and what you need to do to change the policies and the laws that have put us here. So if there aren't any more questions, Dr. Mack is signing off. Love you guys to life. Please take care of yourselves. Please, if you need to disconnect from social media from time to time, that is okay. Be okay with how you contribute. Be okay that you need moments for self-care. Take care of your mental health first. And then when you are available, when you feel whole, when you feel a place that you can join back into it, lock it back up and do so then. All right. Love you to life.